What if the greatest prison humanity has ever known was never built of stone, but of flesh and bone, your own body? Picture the shadowed hills of ancient Greece, long after sunset, where torchlit processions wind slowly toward hidden sanctuaries carved into the living rock. Listen closely, and you can almost hear the Menitiates whispering hymns that were said to purify the soul. Songs so sacred they could never be written down, only breathed from one trembling voice to another. Our guide through this hidden world is the legendary figure of Orpheus, poet, prophet, and the one man in all of myth who descended into death itself and returned to tell of it. His followers believed something astonishing, that every human being, every one of us, is a divine soul imprisoned in a mortal body, a spark of eternity locked inside a cage of flesh, and they believed there was a way out. The question we will carry with us through this entire journey is a haunting one. If the ancients truly discovered a path to liberate the soul from the endless cycle of rebirth, why did that knowledge almost vanish from history? 25 centuries ago, scattered across the Greek world, secret societies taught exactly this doctrine. Not in the great public temples where crowds gathered to sacrifice to Zeus and Athena, but in quiet places, caves, groves, private chambers lit by a single flame. They called themselves followers of Orpheus, and what they offered was not comfort in this life, but escape from the wheel of existence itself. To the ordinary Greek, death meant a gray, whispering half-life in the house of Hades. But to the Orphic initiate, death was something else entirely, a doorway, a test, perhaps even a homecoming. They carried tiny tablets of hammered gold into their graves, inscribed with instructions for the soul's journey through the underworld, passwords for the afterlife, written in delicate letters, telling the dead soul which road to take, which spring to drink from, and what words to speak to the guardians of the world below. Imagine that for a moment. These people were so certain of the soul's survival that they packed directions for it, the way we might tuck a map into a traveler's coat. And yet here lies the paradox that refuses to die. If this tradition truly held the secret of liberation, it genuinely answered the deepest longing of the human heart. Why did it fade into shadow? Why do most people today know the name of Orpheus only from a love story about a man who looked back too soon, while the spiritual revolution attached to his name lies buried under 2,500 years of silence? Great empires leave ruins, great religions leave scriptures, but the Orphic Mysteries left only fragments, broken hymns, scattered gold leaves pulled from ancient graves, and the echoes of their ideas hidden inside the philosophy of men like Pythagoras and Plato. It is as if history itself conspired to keep the secret, or perhaps the secret was designed from the very beginning to be found only by those who searched for it. Before we descend any further into this mystery, let me say this from the heart. If you love ancient mysteries, sacred rituals, Greek mythology, esoteric philosophy, and knowledge that history has almost forgotten, subscribe to the channel now. Every video is carefully researched from reliable historical, archaeological, and philosophical sources to uncover secrets that time has nearly erased. Your subscription means these forgotten voices keep speaking, and it means you will be here with us for every step of the journeys still to come. Now let us be clear about what we are truly facing, because the Orphic Mysteries are so often misunderstood. This was not merely a cult worshipping a mythical musician. It was not a fringe superstition or a poetic fantasy. The Orphic tradition was, in truth, one of humanity's earliest complete spiritual philosophies, a coherent system of thought that dared to ask and dared to answer 4 questions that have haunted every civilization since. What is the soul? Why do human beings suffer? Is death truly the end? And if the soul is trapped, how can it be freed from the cycle of rebirth? Long before Plato wrote of the soul's immortality, long before Eastern and Western traditions debated reincarnation and liberation, the Orphics had already woven these questions into a single vision. that we are fallen divinities, that our suffering comes from forgetting what we are, and that through purity, remembrance, and sacred initiation, the soul can break its chains and return to its source. This is the thesis at the heart of everything you are about to hear. The Orphic Mysteries were not a footnote to Greek religion. They were a hidden river flowing beneath it, feeding the roots of Western thought in ways most people have never suspected. So here is the map of our descent and, if we are fortunate, our return. First, we will ask who Orpheus really was. The man behind the myth, the voice that could charm stones and silence rivers, the prophet whose journey into the underworld became the model for every soul seeking the light. Then we will open the sealed doors of the mysteries themselves and ask what they actually taught, the strange and beautiful story of Dionysus torn apart by titans, of humanity born from divine ash and ancient guilt, of golden tablets and purifying rites and lives of deliberate holiness. We will ask why these teachings were guarded with such fierce secrecy, whispered only to the initiated, hidden inside symbols and songs. We will trace how these ideas flowed into Pythagoras and Plato, and through them into the very foundations of Western philosophy, into Gnosticism, into Christian mysticism, into the esoteric currents of the Renaissance, quietly, persistently, into the spiritual questions of our own age. And finally, we will ask the most intimate question of all. Do these ideas still live inside us today? When you feel that strange ache of not quite belonging to this world, that sense that you are more than the body you wake up in you, without knowing it, hearing the faint echo of an Orphic hymn. This is a story about death, but it is really a story about hope. It is a story about secrecy, but it is really a story about memory, about a tradition that believed the greatest tragedy is not dying, but forgetting who you are. The Orphics looked at the human condition and refused to accept it as final. They looked at the grave and saw a gate. They looked at the body and saw a prison. Yes, but a prison with a key hidden somewhere inside it. And for centuries, in torchlight and silence, they passed that key from hand to hand. But before we can understand the secret, we must first walk through the world that gave birth to it, a world where God still walked among mortals, where oracles spoke in riddles from sacred smoke, and where every temple guarded a sacred silence. Come with me now, back to the beginning, back to a Greece older and stranger than the one you learned about in school. The torches are lit, the procession is waiting, and somewhere ahead, in the darkness, a voice is singing. Imagine for a moment that you are standing on a hillside in ancient Greece, nearly 2,500 years ago. The sun is setting over the Aegean, turning the sea to hammered bronze. Below you, a village prepares its evening fires, and the smell of roasting barley and olive wood drifts up on the wind. Somewhere in the distance, a shepherd's flute rises and falls, and you cannot quite tell whether the melody is human or something older, something that lives in the rocks themselves. This is not the Greece of marble statues in museums, cold and white and silent. This is a living world, painted in color, thick with incense, loud with prayer. And in this world, the boundary between gods and mortals is thin, so thin that on certain nights, in certain places, it seems to disappear entirely. Here, the gods are not distant abstractions. They are neighbors. Zeus gathers his storms on the mountaintops you can see from your doorstep. Poseidon shakes the ground beneath your feet when he is angry. A stranger at your gate might be a beggarer, might be a god in disguise, testing your hospitality. Every spring has its nymph, every grove its guardian spirit, every crossroads its watching presence. When you pour wine, you spill the first drops onto the earth, because the earth is listening. When you swear an oath, you swear it before beings who remember. The sacred is not confined to one day of the week or one book on a shelf. It is woven into the bread you bake, the child you name, the grave you tend. To live in this Greece is to live inside a conversation with the invisible that never stops. And rising above it all, quite literally, Is Mount Olympus its peak so often wrapped in cloud that people said the gods themselves had drawn a veil across their hall? To the ordinary Greek, Olympus was not a metaphor, it was an address. Somewhere up there, beyond the snow line, Zeus held court, and the fates of cities were decided over cups of nectar. But Olympus was only one point on a map crowded with holy places. Travel south, and you come to Delphi, clinging to the slopes of Mount Parnassus like a swallow's nest. Pilgrims came here from every corner of the known world, climbing the sacred way past treasuries glittering with gold, to ask their questions of the Pythia priestess, seated on a tripod above a cleft in the earth. Breathing vapors that rose from the rock, her eyes rolled back, her voice no longer her own. Through her, they believed, Apollo himself spoke. Kings asked whether to go to war, farmers asked whether to plant, and carved into the temple stone were two words that would echo through all of Western philosophy: know thyself, travel again. This time toward Athens, and just beyond the city, you find Eleusis, a modest town that held one of the most jealously guarded secrets of the ancient world. For nearly 2,000 years, initiates walked the road from Athens to Eleusis to take part in the mysteries of Demeter and Persephone, rites so sacred that revealing them was punishable by death. We still do not know exactly what happened inside that torchlit hall. We only know what the initiates said afterward, that they no longer feared death, that they had seen something, that the grave had lost its terror. Thousands upon thousands passed through those door slaves and emperors alike, and virtually none of them ever broke the silence. And then there were the wild places, far from the ordered temples, on the mountainsides of Thrace and Boeotia, the followers of Dionysus gathered by night. Picture it: torches streaming sparks into the darkness, drums beating like a second heartbeat, women with ivy in their hair dancing until the boundary of the self dissolved, until they were no longer citizens or wives or mothers, but something raw and ecstatic and free. The Greeks had a word for what happened in those rites: enthouasmos, the god within. To be filled with the god. To step, for one burning night, outside the walls of ordinary life. Now, here is something crucial to understand, because everything that follows depends on it. Greek religion had two faces. The public face was the religion of the city. The great festivals, the processions, the animal sacrifices on open-air altars, the smoke rising to heaven while the community feasted below. This was religion as a social contract. You honored the gods, and the gods, if you were fortunate, kept the harvests coming and the plagues away. It was beautiful, it was binding, and it held cities together. But it made almost no promises about you, about your soul, about what happened after your body was laid in the earth. In Homer's telling, the afterlife awaiting nearly everyone was the same gray, whispering half-existence in the house of Hadessa shadows fate, regardless of how well or badly you had lived. And so, alongside the public religion, another current rank-weeder, deeper, hidden, the mystery religions. The very word mystery comes from the Greek mystes, an initiate, one whose lips are sealed. These traditions offered what the civic cults never did: a personal path, secret knowledge, transformation. The astonishing promise that death was not a wall but a doorway, and that with the right preparation, the right purity, the right words, the soul could pass through it into something better. If public religion asked, "What do the gods require of the city?" the mysteries asked a far more intimate question: "What will become of me?" Within this hidden current, two divine figures stood like opposite poles of a single magnet. On one side, Apollo, god of light, of music and measured harmony, of prophecy and healing, the patron of order and clarity, the god who says, "Know thyself, nothing in excess." On the other side, Dionysus, god of the vine and the vintage, of ecstasy and dissolution, of masks and madness, of dying and being born again, the god who says, "Lose yourself and find what lies beneath." Most Greeks experienced these two as a tension, even an opposition. But the tradition we are following in this story did something remarkable, something almost unheard of. It wove them together. Apollonian purity of life joined to Dionysian mystery of death and rebirth, the lyre and the torch in the same pair of hands. Hold on to that image. It is the signature of everything to come, because by the 7th and 6th centuries before the Common Era, something was stirring in the Greek soul. You can feel it in the records that survive. Sacred caves across Greece and Crete were being used for incubation and initiation places, where seekers descended into the earth's darkness, to dream, to be purified, to symbolically die and return. Wandering holy men and oracle singers moved from city to city, carrying purifications, healing rites, and strange songs about the soul's origins. In the Greek colonies of southern Italy, a man named Pythagoras was gathering a brotherhood around a startling teaching. That the soul is immortal, that it migrates from body to body, and that a disciplined, purified life could change its destiny. And among ordinary people, farmers, sailors, mothers who had buried children there, was a growing hunger, an ache the official altars could not soothe. They wanted to know why they suffered. They wanted to know if love outlasted the funeral fire. They wanted answers, and the smoke of civic sacrifice gave them none. This was the soil, rich, restless, aching with question. And it was into this soil, somewhere in those centuries of ferment, that a strange seed was planted, a tradition that would take the wildness of Dionysus, the purity of Apollo, the discipline of Pythagoras, and the ancient promise of the mysteries, and fuse them into a single path of salvation. But every path needs a founder, every tradition needs a face. And into this world of gods and shadows stepped a figure unlike any other, a man whose music, they said, could tame wild beasts, halt rivers in their courses, and even soften the heart of death itself. His name was Orpheus. They said he was born of music itself. His mother was Calliope, the muse of epic poetry, the voice behind every great song ever sung, and his father, in most tellings, was a Thracian king. Though some whispered that his true father was Apollo, the god of light and harmony. Whatever the truth of his blood, the gift was undeniable. Apollo gave the boy a lyre, and when Orpheus touched its strings, the world itself stopped to listen. This was not mere skill. This was something older, something that reached beneath the surface of things. When Orpheus sang, stones rolled closer to hear him. Rivers slowed in their beds. Oak trees on the mountainsides of Thrace uprooted themselves and leaned toward the sound. Wild wolves lay down beside deer, and neither felt fear. His music did not simply please the ear, it reminded every living and unliving thing of some harmony it had forgotten, some original song from before the world was broken. The heroes of Greece knew his worth. When Jason gathered the Argonauts for the voyage to seize the Golden Fleece, he did not bring Orpheus for his sword. He brought him for his voice. When the rowers grew weary, Orpheus set the rhythm of the oars. When storms rose, his music calmed the waters. And when the ship passed the island of the Sirenstos, creatures whose song lured sailors to their deaths on the rocks, Orpheus did something no warrior could have done. He did not cover the crew's ears. He simply played louder and more beautifully, until the deadly song of the sirens dissolved into his own. He defeated death not with violence, but with a superior music. Remember that detail. It will matter. But it is not the voyages that made Orpheus immortal in memory. It is a love story and a wound. Her name was Eurydice. The myths tell us almost nothing about her, and perhaps that is the point. To Orpheus, she was everything, and to the story, she is the soul itself. They were married beneath the open sky, and the myths say that even Hymen, the god of weddings, arrived with a torch that sputtered and smoked an omen no one wished to read. And on that very day, as Eurydice walked through the tall grass, a serpent struck her heel. By nightfall, the bride was gone. The wedding songs were still warm in the air when the funeral songs began. What does a man do when the person who is his whole world crosses a border no living soul may cross? Any other man would have grieved and endured and slowly turned to stone inside. But Orpheus was not any other man. He took his lyre, And he walked to the edge of the world, to the cave said to lead downward into the kingdom of the dead, and he descended. Alive, breathing, his heart hammering in his chest, he walked into the land from which no one returns. And there, in the darkness, he did the only thing he knew how to do. He sang. He sang to Charon, the grim ferryman, who wept and carried him across the black river without payment. He sang to Cerberus, the three-headed hound, whose growling faded into something like a whimper. He sang past the fields of drifting shades, who gathered around him like moths around a flame, remembering, for one aching moment, what it had felt like to be alive. And at last he stood before the thrones of Hades and Persephone, the lord and queen of the dead, and he sang of Eurydice. He sang of love cut short. He sang that all of Theme's very soul in that grey kingdom would come to Hades. Eventually, that death's harvest was certain, and he asked only that Eurydice's thread be rewoven for a little while longer. The myths say that for the first time in eternity, the cheeks of the iron-hearted Furies were wet with tears. Persephone, who knew what it was to be taken below, turned to her husband. And Hades, who never yielded. One condition: Eurydice would follow behind him as he climbed back toward the light. But he must not look back, not once, not until both of them stood in the world of the living. You know what happens. Everyone knows what happens, and still it breaks the heart every time. He climbed through the darkness, hearing nothing behind him, no footsteps, no breath, for the dead make no sound. Doubt gnawed at him with every step. Was she there? Had the gods deceived him? The mouth of the cave appeared ahead, a circle of grey light, and there, on the very threshold, with the sun almost touching his face, love and fear overwhelmed him. He turned, and he saw her for one instant. He saw her face as she was pulled backward into the dark, her arms reaching, her voice speaking a single word: farewell. He lost her twice, and the second loss was the one he had caused himself. Now, the ancient Orphics did not hear this story as a romance alone. They heard it as a map. In their eyes, Orpheus was the first initiate archetype of every seeker who would come after him. He had done the impossible. He had descended into death while still alive, faced its rulers, learned its geography, its rivers, its guardians, its loss, and returned to tell of it. The Greeks had a word for this descent: katabasis, the going down, and the entire Orphic path was, in a sense, a rehearsal of Orpheus's journey. The initiate would learn, in secret rites, how to descend, what to say to the powers below, how to navigate the darkness so that when real death came, the soul would not wander lost, but would walk a road it already knew. Orpheus's failure was also a teaching. The ancient enemy of the soul is doubt, the backward glance, the inability to trust the unseen. He turned because he could not believe without seeing. The initiate was taught to do better. Orpheus himself never recovered. He wandered the wilds of Thrace, singing only laments, refusing all human company. And there, the myths say, he met his end torn apart by the Maenads, the frenzied women of Dionysus, who ripped his body limb from limb. It is a savage ending, but listen to what happened next, because it is one of the most haunting images in all of Greek myth. His severed head, still singing, floated down the river Hebrus and out to sea until it came to rest on the island of Lesbos, where it continued to sing and to prophesy, becoming an oracle that people traveled far to consult. Even death could not silence the voice. And the Orphics noticed something else, something deliberate in the symmetry. Orpheus was dismembered, just as the child god Dionysus had once been dismembered by the Titans in the tradition's central myth. The founder's fate mirrored the gods. The singer and the divinity he served were bound together by the same wound, torn apart, yet never truly destroyed. Did Orpheus actually live? Historians will tell you honestly, we do not know. Perhaps there was a real Thracian singer behind the legend. Perhaps he was always a figure of myth. But here is what we know for certain. By the 6th century before the Common Era, something remarkable was happening across the Greek world. Poems were circulating, theogonies, accounts of the birth of the gods, that differed radically from Homer and Hesiod. Sacred hymns, verses about the soul, instructions concerning purity and the afterlife, and all of them bore a single name, Orpheus. His name had become a signature, a seal of revealed truth, the way a voice from beyond the ordinary world signs its messages. And the words did not stay on the page. Wandering priests, the Orpheotilistae, initiators of Orpheus, traveled from city to city, door to door, offering purifications and secret rites in his name, promising that what Orpheus had learned in the darkness below could be learned by anyone willing to walk his path. A myth had become a movement, and yet there is the strange thing: the true heart of that movement was not the story of Orpheus at all. Hidden at the center of his teachings lay a darker, stranger myth, a divine crime committed at the dawn of time, a murder among the gods themselves. Son, that explained, the Orphics believed, why every human soul is at war with itself. I'm settling into the narrative voice for this piece on Dionysus Zagreus, aiming for that intimate, emotionally resonant tone, while keeping it within the character limit and avoiding structural elements like headings or calls to act. To understand that war, we have to go back further than Orpheus himself, back before the first human being drew breath, to a moment the Orphics believed was the true beginning of our story. Not the beginning of the world, but the beginning of us, the strange divided creatures we still are. And it begins, as so many Greek stories do, with a child, a very special child. His name was Dionysus Zagreus, and he was no ordinary god. Zeus, the king of the gods, had fathered him with Persephone, the queen of the underworld, in the hidden dark beneath the earth. From the moment of his birth, this child was marked for greatness. Zeus loved him beyond all his other children, and in that love he made a decision that would shake the cosmos. He set the infant upon his own throne. He placed the thunderbolt, the very symbol of supreme power, into those tiny hands. He surrounded him with guardians and declared, before all creation, that this small child would one day rule the universe in his place. The heir to the throne of heaven had been chosen, and he was barely old enough to walk. But power like that is never given without envy following close behind. In the shadows, the Titans were watching the ancient, primordial beings who had ruled before the Olympian gods, the old order that Zeus and his kin had overthrown. They had not forgotten their defeat. And now, to see this child lifted above them all, to see the throne promised to an infant, kindled in them a hatred as old as the world itself. So they laid a plan, not a plan of open war, for they had already lost that war. This was something colder, more patient, more cruel. They came to the child not as monsters but as playmates, and here the myth turns unbearably tender and unbearably dark. The Titans whitened their faces with gypsum, with chalk-white clay, so they would not be recognized, so their terrible ancient nature would be hidden behind a mask of pale innocence. And they brought gifts. Toys. The kinds of things that make a child laugh and reach out with open hands. A mirror, in which the divine infant could see his own bright face gazing back. A spinning top that hummed as it turned. Knucklebones to toss and catch. Golden apples, tufts of wool, a bull roarer that sang on the wind. Imagine it, this radiant child, destined to rule all things, distracted and delighted, leaning toward the mirror, entranced by his own reflection. And in that moment of wonder, they seized him. What the Titans did next is the crime that sits at the very center of the Orphic universe. They tore the child apart. They dismembered the little god, limb from limb, and Thenthis is the detail. The Orphics never let their initiates forget. They devoured his flesh. They ate the divine child, the heir of heaven, the promised king, consumed by the jealous old powers of a world that refused to pass away. It is a myth so violent, so intimate in its horror that it can be hard to sit with. And yet the Orphics believed that everything about who we are begins right here, in this act of swallowing the divine. The crime did not go unanswered. High above, Zeus saw what had been done to his beloved son, and his grief became a fury that no words could hold. He raised his thunderbolt and he struck. The Titans were incinerated, where they stood burned to nothing in a blast of divine fire, reduced to ash and rising smoke. And it is from this smoke, from these smoldering ashes, that the Orphic myth gives us its most breathtaking and unsettling revelation. For the ashes of the Titans were not simply the remains of guilty gods. Mingled within them was the divine flesh of Dionysus, the flesh they had eaten just before they died. Titanic matter and divine substance fused together in the ruin of the fire, and from that ash, from that terrible mixture of the sacred and the monstrous human race was born. That is who we are, the Orphics taught. We are made from the ashes of a crime. In our very substance, in the clay of our being, two natures are bound together and cannot be separated. There is the dark, violent, earthbound residue of the Titans' rebellion, their hunger, their appetite, their refusal to let go. And there is, buried within us, hidden like a spark in the ash, a fragment of the god they consumed. A piece of Dionysus lives in every human heart. We carry the divine child inside us still, and the child, mercifully, was not entirely lost. In most versions of the myth, the goddess Athena rushed in and rescued the one part of Dionysus that had not been devoured, his heart. Still beating, still warm, she carried it to Zeus, and from that surviving heart the god was made whole again and born a second time. This is why Dionysus is called the twice-born, the god who dies and returns, the deity of resurrection, whose story whispers a promise into the ruins, that what is torn apart can be gathered again, that death is not the final word. But for us, the children of the ash, that promise came with a price. Because of the ancient crime woven into our origin, the Orphics taught that the divine soul within us has been imprisoned, locked inside the body, as a punishment, as a debt inherited from the Titans who came before. And here they gave us one of the most haunting phrases in all of ancient thought. Soma sema, they said. The body is a tomb. The Greek words even sound alike, as if the language itself were letting us in on the secret. The flesh you live in, the body you feed and dress and carry through the world, is not truly your home. It is your grave. It is the cell in which your immortal soul has been confined, serving out a sentence for a crime committed at the dawn of time, and escape does not come easily. The soul, they believed, is condemned to a long and weary journey metempsychosis, the wheel of rebirth. When the body dies, the soul does not rest. It is drawn back down, poured into another body and another and another. A human being, an animal, even in some tellings, a plant, rooted and silent, waiting. Life after life after life, the soul wanders from form to form, paying its ancient debt in installments, until at last it is purified enough to be released. To the Orphic, ordinary life was not a single precious gift. It was one turn on an endless wheel, one more cell in a prison stretching across countless lifetimes. And so existence itself became something more than living. It became a struggle, a quiet, constant, deeply personal struggle, waged inside every human being. On one side, the divine soul, that spark of Dionysus, longing to remember what it truly is and to return to where it came from. On the other, the titanic body, with all its appetites and cravings and its heavy pull toward the earth, always dragging the spark back down into forgetfulness. Every meal, every desire, every choice became a small battle in an ancient war. To be human, in the Orphic vision, was to be a battlefield. This is the vision that spread. The hymns were composed to be sung in the flickering light of secret rites, calling the gods by their hidden names. The initiators carried the teaching out along the roads, across the Greek mainland, and over the sea to the wealthy cities of southern Italy and Sicily, where the doctrine took deep root, and into the graves of those who had been initiated. Mourners placed thin sheets of gold, inscribed with instructions, passwords for the soul, maps for the journey through the underworld, telling the departed what to say and which spring to drink from, so that it would not forget its divine origin and stumble back onto the wheel. These were passports, folded into the hands of the dead, guiding the trapped spark home. which means that the true enemy in the Orphic story was never a monster prowling the dark, and never a rival god upon some distant mountain. The enemy was something far more intimate than that. It was something each initiate carried inside their own chest, something they woke with every morning and lay down with every night, the ancient darkness woven into their very flesh, waiting. I'm going to write out a warm, emotional narration section in prose form, aiming for around 7,500 characters to really capture the feeling and depth of the moment. So let us name that enemy plainly, because the Orphics did. It had no army and it wore no crown. It could not be slain with a sword or bargained with by sacrifice. Its first face was ignorance, what the Greeks called agnoiath simple, catastrophic failure to know what you truly are. Imagine walking through your entire life as a king who believes himself a beggar, sleeping in the dirt outside the gates of his own palace, never once suspecting that the throne inside belongs to him. That was the human condition, as the Orphics understood it. We are luminous beings who have forgotten our own light, and forgetting, they insisted, is not a small thing. Forgetting is the wound through which everything else pours in, because from that first ignorance came all the others. Attachment to the flesh, to the appetites that rise and fall like tides, to gold and property, and the frantic hunger to possess. The pollution of the soul, its bright surface clouded over by every act of cruelty, every indulgence, every day spent chasing shadows, and behind all of it, turning slowly and without mercy. The great wheel of rebirth, the cycle, the Greeks called the wheel of necessity, on which the unpurified soul is bound again and again, dying only to be born once more into a new body, a new life of longing and loss, with no memory of the lives that came before. This was the true horror at the heart of Orphism, not death. Death they could almost welcome. What they feared was that death would not be the end at all, but merely a turning of the wheel, a return to the prison under a different name. And here the Orphic vision becomes genuinely terrifying, in the way only the oldest human fears can be. They taught that after death the ordinary soul comes to a place of two springs. One is guarded, cool and clear, and the other rises beside a white cypress tree. And this second spring is the water of Lethe, the water of forgetting. The exhausted, frightened soul, thirsty from its long journey, stoops to drink, and in that drinking it loses everything. It forgets its divine origin, forgets the lives it lived, forgets the very lessons that might have set it free. Wiped clean, it is swept back down into a body, born again into a world it does not recognize, condemned to repeat the whole aching cycle from the beginning. This is why the Orphics warned, in words that still chill when we read them, that the uninitiated soul will lie forever in the mire and filth of the underworld, sunk in the mud, going nowhere. To be uninitiated was to be unprepared. To be unprepared was to be lost. Against this, the Orphics raised their single greatest weapon, and it was not a weapon of iron or fire. It was memory. They personified her as Mnemosyne, and against the spring of forgetting they placed the sacred spring of remembrance. The initiate was taught in life to remember what he wastes to hold fast to the knowledge of his own divinity so tightly that not even death could shake it loose. Memory was the thread that could lead the soul back out of the labyrinth, and so the whole of the Orphic path becomes, in a sense, a training in remembering, a lifelong effort to keep the flame of true knowledge burning against the vast, patient darkness that wanted only to make you forget. But how does one live so as to remember? This is where Orphism stopped being mere belief and became a discipline, a daily practice, what the ancients called the Orphikos bios, the Orphic life. It was a way of living designed to purify the soul and loosen the body's grip upon it. At its center stood a refusal that startled the ancient world. The Orphics would not eat meat. They were among the first vegetarians in Western history, and their reasons were not merely tender. To eat the flesh of an animal was to take part in killing, and killing was bound up with the endless spilling of blood that turned the wheel. More than that, If souls migrate from body to body, then the beast on the altar might carry a soul as kindred to your own as any humans. To sacrifice it, to devour it, was to participate in the very cycle you were trying to escape. So they abstained. They kept themselves ritually pure. They wore white garments, the color of the unstained soul. They kept away from the pollution that the Greeks believed clung to birth and to death, avoiding the places where these thresholds were crossed. And through it all they practiced catharsis, a continual, patient cleansing of the divine spark, buried within them, wiping away the soot of the world, so that the light might shine a little clearer each day. And at the heart of this life stood the secret rites, themselves the teletai, the initiations. Here our sources grow quiet, guarded, deliberately incomplete, because these were mysteries in the truest sense, and to speak of them openly was forbidden. But we can trace their shape. They took place at night, by torchlight, in the hush of sacred enclosures. Hymns were sung, the ancient Orphic hymns addressed to the gods and to the powers of the soul. Sacred objects were brought out and revealed to the trembling initiate things, kept hidden from all but the worthy. And through it all ran a great symbolic drama, a reenactment of the death and rebirth of Dionysus, torn apart and yet living still. The initiate did not merely watch this story. He entered it. He was made to undergo a kind of death himself, a ritual dying, and then a rebirth that he might experience, while still breathing, the very passage his soul would one day have to make in earnest. He rehearsed his own death so that when the true moment came, he would not be a stranger to it. He would know the way, and this is why the secrecy was not mere theatrics or the guarding of a guild's privileges. To reveal the mysteries was to commit a kind of spiritual betrayal, to hand the sacred over to those unready to receive it, to break a trust that reached beyond this life into the next. For a long time, skeptics wondered whether any of this was real, whether the Orphics were a genuine movement or merely a shadow cast by later imaginations. And then the earth gave up its evidence. In 1962, in northern Greece, near a place called Derveni, archaeologists sifting through the remains of an ancient funeral pyre found a papyrus scroll, half-burned but readable, and it turned out to be the oldest surviving manuscript in all of Europe. It was a philosophical commentary, written centuries before Christ, explaining line by line the hidden meanings of an Orphic poem about the birth of the gods. Someone had loved that text enough to carry it into the fire of the dead. And on the shores of the Black Sea, in the ancient colony of Olbia, small bone tablets were unearthed, scratched with words that leap across the centuries. Life, death, life. Dionysus, Orphic. These were not the daydreams of later poets. They were the fingerprints of a living, breathing religion people who had written these words, buried these scrolls, scratched these bones, because they staked their eternity upon them. And for those who completed the path, who lived pure, who learned the secrets, who faced death already prepared for, the Orphics left behind something extraordinary. Tiny sheets of gold, hammered thin as a leaf, and folded with the care one gives to something precious beyond price, buried in the hands and against the hearts of the dead. Upon them were inscribed instructions, the words a soul would need for the most dangerous journey it could ever take. I'm working on a narrative section in English, with an emotionally warm tone, aiming for around 700-500 characters, while staying within the 6,600-8,700 range, continuing naturally from the previous discussion about gold tablets. These golden leaves have a name now, though the people who made them needed none. We call them the Orphic gold tablets, and they have surfaced in the most unexpected corners of the ancient world. In the soil of Thurii and Petelia, in southern Italy, in the tombs of Hipponion, on the island of Crete, in the burial grounds of Thessaly, in northern Greece, archaeologists, brushing away centuries of dust, have found them again and again, some reaching back to the 5th century before Christ. Paper-thin, no larger than the palm of a hand, They were folded and pressed into the fingers of the dead, tucked against a still chest, or slipped between silent lips, so that even in the darkness of the grave, the soul would carry its instructions with it. They are, in the most literal sense, passports for the dead. Maps for a country no living traveler has ever charted, and when you read the words scratched into that fragile metal, you realize you are hearing a voice speaking directly to a soul, about to step out of its body and into the unknown. Picture what these tablets describe. The soul, newly freed from the flesh, arrives in the halls of Hades. It is disoriented, perhaps frightened, stripped of everything it knew, and there, in the dim geography of the underworld, it comes upon two springs of water. To the left stands a white cypress, pale and gleaming, and beside it flows a spring, but the tablets warn, in urgent, almost pleading words, "Do not drink there. That is the water of Lethe, the water of forgetfulness. To drink it is to lose everything, to forget who you are, to forget that you were ever divine, and to be swept back, blind and empty, into the endless cycle of birth once more. The soul must resist the easy, tempting water. It must walk further, to the lake of memory, cool and clear, guarded by watchful sentinels who will not let just anyone approach. They will challenge the soul. They will ask who it is and why it has come. And here the tablets give the dead the most precious thing of all the words to say. The soul must declare the sacred password, the phrase it learned in life and carried faithfully into death. "I am a child of earth and of starry heaven," it must say, "but my race is of heaven alone." Feel the weight of those words. In them is the entire Orphic vision compressed into a single breath. Yes, the soul admits, "I was born of the earth. I wore a body of clay. I lived among mortal things. But that was never the whole truth. My true lineage is the sky. My true home is among the stars and the gods. I have not forgotten, and because it remembers, because it did not drink the water of forgetting, because it kept the knowledge pure through a lifetime of disciplineth guardians, step aside." They give the soul the cold water of memory to drink, and it passes onward, awake and aware, into a destiny reserved for those who knew who they truly were. And what is that destiny? The tablets from Thuri do not whisper it, they proclaim it. "Happy and blessed one," they say to the soul, "you shall be a god instead of a mortal." Let that sentence settle over you. Not a ghost, not a shade drifting forever in the gloom. A god. The mortal has shed mortality, the way a traveler sheds a dusty cloak at the end of a long road. Another tablet murmurs a phrase stranger and more tender still, a secret token exchanged between the initiate and the powers of the beyond a kid. "I have fallen into milk." A young goat that has tumbled into a stream of milk, into nourishment, into sweetness, into a mother's care. It is an image of arrival, of homecoming, of being gathered up and held. And who waits to receive the soul at the end of this journey? Persephone, the queen of the underworld, the grieving mother who mourned the murdered child Dionysus, the goddess who understands loss more deeply than any other. She receives the purified soul like a mother, welcoming home a child long lost, and she grants what the Orphics longed for above all, else release. Release from what one tablet calls the grievous circle, the heavy, sorrowful wheel of death and rebirth that had turned for lifetime after lifetime. The soul steps off the wheel at last. The long exile is over. And now, if you have followed this journey with me, something extraordinary happens. All the threads we have gathered across this story begin to draw together, and you can feel them locking into place. The immortal soul trapped in the body, the endless rounds of reincarnation, the lifelong work of purification, the secret initiation that prepared the soul for death, the vegetarian discipline, the refusal to add to the world's violence, the sacred hymns sung to cleanse and to remember, the myth of Dionysus Zagreus, torn apart by the Titans, the double nature of humankind, part earthly ash and part divine spark, Persephone waiting at the threshold, and now, at the very end, memory triumphing over forgetfulness as the soul chooses the right spring and speaks the right words. Every single piece belongs to the others. Nothing is loose. Nothing is random. This is the moment the truth of it becomes impossible to ignore. This was never a scattered handful of superstitions, a jumble of folk fears about the dark. It was a complete architecture of salvation, a system as carefully engineered as any temple, with every stone bearing weight, every element supporting the whole. The myth explained why the soul suffered, the purification cleansed it, the initiation instructed it, the tablets guided it, and the reward crowned it. 25 centuries ago, without scripture as we know it, without churches or councils or written creeds, human beings had constructed a coherent philosophy of the soul's origin, its fall, its struggle, and its ultimate return home. So let yourself sit with what these fragile golden leaves are really telling us. The Orphic Mysteries were not merely Greek mythology, not just beautiful stories told around ancient fires. They were a path of transformation. Perhaps they were the West's very first systematic promise that an ordinary human being could, through knowledge, through purity, through the stubborn act of remembering who they truly were, become divine. Not by accident, not by the whim of a god, but by walking a road that could be taught, learned, and completed. Think of the people who believed this. Not kings, not philosophers only, but ordinary men and women, farmers and weavers and mothers and sons, who lived their quiet lives and were laid to rest with a scrap of gold in their hands, inscribed with the promise that they would rise as gods, buried with godhood folded against their hearts. That is the image I want you to carry. That is the weight of what these people dared to hope. An idea this powerful could not stay hidden in caves and tombs forever. It was too luminous, too dangerous, too alive. Slowly, quietly, it began to seep out into the minds of the greatest thinkers Greece would ever produce, and through them, this secret vision of the soul would escape the darkness of the mystery cults altogether, and begin almost invisibly to reshape the entire Western world. I'm drafting a narrative section on Orphism's influence throughout Western intellectual history, aiming for around 7,500 characters, while staying within the 6,600 to 8,700 range. It begins with a man whose name still echoes through mathematics classrooms, though almost no one remembers what he truly believed. Pythagoras. We know him for the theorem, for triangles and numbers, but in the ancient world, he was something far stranger and far greater, mystic, a prophet, the founder of a secret brotherhood in the southern Italian city of Croton. And when you look closely at what that brotherhood taught, you begin to feel a chill of recognition. For it is the Orphic vision alive and breathing in a new form. Pythagoras and his followers believed the soul was immortal and divine. They believed it did not die with the body but passed from life to life, transmigrating through many forms, bound to the wheel of rebirth until it could be purified. They practiced vegetarianism, refusing to eat flesh, because to kill an animal might be to kill a kindred soul. They lived by discipline, by sacred silence, by rituals of cleansing meant to raise the spirit above the appetites of the flesh. And they believed, perhaps most beautifully of all, that music and number held a divine power, that the harmony of the cosmos could be heard in a plucked string, and that by attuning the soul to that harmony, one could remember what one truly was. Does this sound familiar? It should. It is the same promise carried on those golden tablets. The same faith that the soul is a fallen god, that the body is a prison, that purity and knowledge are the road home. The overlap is so complete that the ancient writers themselves could barely tell the two apart. They spoke of Orphic Pythagorean teachings as if they were a single thing, and in truth, they may have been two streams flowing from one hidden spring, two channels of the same river, winding through the ancient world, carrying the same luminous idea downstream toward the future. And downstream, waiting, was the mind that would change everything. Plato. It is difficult to overstate what Plato means to Western thought. Nearly every philosophical question we still ask was shaped by his hand. And Plato was steeped in these older mysteries. He drank from them. He built with them. Read his dialogue the Phaedo, written as Socrates calmly awaits his own execution, and you find the Orphic vision spoken in the language of philosophy, the soul imprisoned within the body, longing for release, echoing that ancient wordplay, soma sema, the body a tomb. Plato even writes that philosophy itself is nothing less than the practice of dying, the discipline of freeing the soul from the flesh while still alive. Turn to the Republic, to the haunting myth of and you watch souls in the afterlife choose their next lives and then drink from the river. Lethe, the water of forgetting, so that they descend into new bodies remembering nothing of where they came from. It is the wheel of rebirth again. It is the danger of forgetting, the very danger the golden tablets were meant to guard against. And in dialogues like the Meno and the Phaedrus, Plato gives us an amnesis idea that learning is really remembering, that the soul already knows divine truth and only needs to recall it, to wake from its long forgetfulness. Plato names the Orphics directly. He does not hide his debt. And because Plato became the foundation of Western philosophy, these ideas did not stay in the temples and the tombs. Through him, they entered the very bloodstream of our civilization, flowing into every century that followed, whether or not those who inherited them ever knew the name of Orpheus. The current did not stop there. Centuries later, the Neoplatonists Plotinus, and after him Proclus, who openly revered the Orphic Theogones, built an entire majestic architecture of the spirit around this vision. They described the soul's descent from the Divine One into the world of matter, and its long, aching journey of return back up through the levels of being toward the source of all light. It is the Orphic story made into a complete metaphysics, a map of the soul's exile and homecoming. And then, in the same restless centuries, another movement rose whose parallels are almost startling: Gnosticism. The Gnostics taught that within each human being lies a divine spark, a fragment of light trapped in the darkness of the material world. They taught that salvation comes not through ritual sacrifice, but through gnosis, secret saving knowledge, an awakening from cosmic sleep, a remembering of one's true origin beyond the stars, the divine spark in matter, salvation through hidden knowledge, awakening from forgetfulness. We have heard every note of this song before. Even the early followers of Christ felt the pull of this ancient imagery. In the catacombs beneath Rome, where the first Christians buried their dead, we find painted upon the walls the figure of Orpheus the singer with his lyre, surrounded by beasts made gentle by his music. To those early believers, Orpheus became an image of Christ himself, the divine musician, the one who descends into death and returns, the shepherd whose song conquers the grave. The myth had become a mirror in which a new faith could see its own reflection. The thread did not break in the ancient world. It ran on through the darkness of forgotten centuries and blazed up again in the Renaissance. In the Florence of the Medici, a scholar named Marsilio Ficino translated the Orphic hymns into Latin, and this is the detail I love. He did not merely study them, he sang them. He took up a lyre, as Orpheus was said to have done, and sang those ancient hymns aloud, believing they could still draw down divine influence and heal the soul. Ficino and his circle spoke of a prisca theologia, an ancient theology, a single stream of sacred wisdom passed down through the ages, with Orpheus honored as one of its founding sages, alongside the mysterious Hermes. Hermeticism, Renaissance magic, the whole dream of a lost and recoverable divine knowledge. Orpheus stood near the heart of it, and still the singer walked on. The Romantic poets took him up, drawn to the image of the artist who descends into the underworld for love and returns transformed. Composers gave him voice on the stage: Monteverdi, at the very birth of opera, and later Glukic retelling the story of the musician who braved death itself. Orpheus became and remains the enduring symbol of the artist who goes down into the darkness for love, for truth, and comes back changed. Which brings us at last to ourselves. Look around at the spiritual landscape of the modern West, and the old currents are still moving beneath the surface. Belief in reincarnation, once the secret of the mysteries, now sits comfortably in ordinary conversation. In the psychology of Carl Jung, we find the descent into the unconscious, the confrontation with the shadow, the long process of individuationa modern katabasis, a journey down into the depths of the self in order to become whole. And in the quiet rooms where researchers study near-death experiences and the riddle of consciousness, scientists find themselves asking the very question the Orphics asked in their darkened caves. Does something in us survive? Is there a part of the human being that the grave cannot hold? The teachings that were meant to be secret, guarded, spoken only to the initiated, have escaped into everything. They shaped the greatest philosopher of the ancient world. They colored the birth of mystical Christianity. They stirred the imagination of the Renaissance and sang from the opera stage, and they may still be shaping, silently, invisibly, the way you yourself think about life and death and the soul. Which brings us back to the paradox we began with. If these teachings were powerful enough to shape Plato, to move the mystics, to reach even into our own modern search for meaning, then how did the Orphic Mysteries themselves, the very source of this vast and living river, almost vanish entirely from the memory of the world? I'm working on the final section of this narration, piece wrapping up the philosophical paradox, drawing out the key lessons from the legacy, and ending with a reflective question that invites the reader to think deeper rather than a direct call to action. Though there's some tension in the instructions about whether to include that closing element. The answer, when we finally trace it, is quieter and stranger than we might expect. The Orphic Mysteries did not vanish because they were weak. They very nearly vanished because they were hidden by design. From the beginning, this was knowledge meant for the few, not the many. It was spoken only to those who had been initiated, who had passed through the rites, who had bound themselves with sacred silence. To reveal the innermost teachings to the uninitiated was not merely frowned upon. It was a betrayal of something holy, and so the deepest truths were rarely written down at all. They passed from mouth to ear, from teacher to student, from one living soul to another, in whispered instruction and remembered song. A tradition carried in breath and memory is a fragile thing. When the mouths fall silent, the knowledge falls with them. What little was committed to writing fared no better against the slow erosion of time. Papyrus crumbles, ink fades, scrolls were copied and recopied until errors crept in. And then, in the great upheavals of history, whole libraries burned. Texts were scattered across the ancient world, surviving only in fragments, in a stray quotation here, a buried gold tablet there, a hymn preserved almost by accident. We hold today only shards of what once was a complete and luminous vision. Imagine trying to reconstruct a cathedral from a handful of stones pulled from a river, and you begin to sense how much has been lost, and how much we are still guessing at in the dark. There is a deeper reason, too. The mystery religions belonged to an age that was passing. As the ancient world changed, as new faiths rose and spread and claimed the hearts of millions, the old rites began to wither. The temples emptied, the initiations ceased. Pagan worship was discouraged, then forbidden, and the secret societies that had guarded these teachings dissolved into memory. The living chain of initiates, unbroken for centuries, finally snapped. And once that chain is broken, there is no one left who remembers how to read the map. For the language of the Orphics was itself a kind of veil. They did not speak plainly. They spoke in symbols, in myth, in image and allegory, precisely because the truths they pointed toward could not be captured in ordinary words. The dismembered god, the gold tablet, the password at the spring, the child of earth and starry heaven. To an initiate, every one of these carried layers of meaning. But to later ages, cut off from the living tradition that decoded them, These symbols grew strange and opaque, like letters in an alphabet no one could read anymore. The truth was not destroyed. It was deliberately clothed in myth, and then the ones who knew how to unclothe it were gone. And here, perhaps, is the great and gentle irony of it all. The Orphic Mysteries remind us that the deepest truths are rarely preserved in monuments of stone. Empires raise their marble columns, and the columns fall. Kings carve their names into obelisks, and the wind wears them smooth. But something else endures. What the Orphics buried in thin sheets of gold, humanity kept rediscovering again and again in philosophy, in art, in music, in the quiet and persistent hunger of the soul for some things it can barely name. The truth survived not because it was locked away, but because it kept being reborn in every heart that asked the old questions. Who am I, really? Why do I suffer? What happens when I die? Is there something in me that does not end? That is why, after more than 2,000 years, the song has never fully faded. You can still hear its echo in philosophy and psychology, in the study of the psyche, that very word the Greeks used for the soul. You can hear it in literature and in sacred music, in every poem of longing and every melody that reaches for the eternal. You can hear it in the symbols we still cannot quite explain, in the enduring belief in reincarnation held by millions across the world, in every story ever told of descent into darkness and return into light. It breathes in modern mystical traditions, in the seeker who lights a candle and asks the silence a question. And it lives, most of all, in the simple, universal search for meaning beyond the material, the refusal to believe that we are only flesh and appetite and nothing more. If we listen closely to everything the Orphics tried to say, we find that their greatest lesson was never the secret rituals themselves. The rites, the hymns, the fasting, the whispered passwords, all of these were only the vessel. The treasure they carried was a single, staggering conviction that every human being, no matter how ordinary, no matter how burdened or broken, carries within them a forgotten fragment of the divine. A spark of something luminous and eternal, buried beneath the noise of the world, sleeping beneath the weight of forgetting, and that each of us, everyone, holds the capacity to awaken, to remember, to return to the sacred origin from which we came. This was the true meaning of the words engraved on those small golden tablets, the words the soul was to speak when it stood trembling before the guardians of the underworld. I am a child of earth and starry heaven, but my race is of heaven alone. Read one way, it is a password to escape the wheel of rebirth. But read more deeply, it is something far greater. It is an act of remembering. It is the soul recalling in its darkest and most disoriented hour who and what it truly is. Not a prisoner of the dust, not a captive of the body, but a child of the stars, briefly clothed in flesh, on a long journey home. And so we return, at the last, to the question that has followed us through this entire journey, the question the Orphics themselves could never fully answer, and perhaps neither can we. What do you believe? Did the Orphic Mysteries preserve some genuine and ancient wisdom about the journey of the soul, a truth glimpsed by those old initiates in their darkened caves and passed down to us in fragments of gold? Or were they beautiful, aching myths, stories woven by human hearts to give shape and comfort and meaning to the terrifying mystery of being alive and knowing that we die? There is no easy answer. Perhaps that is the point. I would love to know where you stand, so share your thoughts in the comments below. I read them, and this is exactly the kind of question I most love to sit with together. And if you have loved wandering through this world with me, through ancient mystery traditions and Greek mythology, through sacred symbols and esoteric philosophy, and the haunting ruins of lost civilizations, then don't forget to like this video, to subscribe, and to ring the bell, so you won't miss our next journey into the greatest mysteries history has ever kept. Because the song of Orpheus never truly ended. It only grew quiet, sinking beneath the centuries, like a melody half remembered, waiting, patient and unhurried, for those still willing to lean in close and listen.